You're listening to Nightlight Radio Network. This is Dr. Bob Hieronimus, co-host of 21st Century Radio. We are happy to present this rebroadcast of our show on Nightlight. We've got rules and regulations. Rules and regulations on 21st Century Radio. We call them R&R. What are they? Human beings aren't machines. Nope, we're not. We have an immortal component which is wiser than you think. 2, we are not alone in the universe, never have been. We live with invisible beings inside and outside our physical bodies. And 3, what we do to the earth, we do to ourselves, and you know what we have done to the earth, and she's just giving it right back to us, and I'm afraid this is going to go on for years and years ahead. Well, during our first hour and a half, we will be reviewing the book Glimpses of Eternity, sharing a loved one's passage from this life to the next by Dr. Raymond Moody, who first joined us in March 1988, and many times after that, of course. And also, it's written with Paul Perry. With us also is Dr. John Turner, who joined us about a year and a half ago to talk about his book, Medicine, Miracles, and Manifestations, A Doctor's Journey Through the Worlds of Divine Revelation, Near-Death Experiences, Universal Energy, etc., etc. Dr. Raymond Moody is a best-selling author of 11 books, including Life After Life, which has sold a measly 13 million copies. 13 million copies worldwide. Is that all? There's a little bit of interest in this, huh? And, of course, Reunions is one of his other books that we talked about, as well as numerous articles in academic and professional literature. Dr. Moody continues to capture enormous public interest and generate controversy with his groundbreaking work on near-death experience and what happens when we die. He is a world-renowned scholar and researcher. Dr. Moody is the leading authority on near-death experience, a phrase he coined in the late 70s. Dr. Moody's research into the phenomenon of near-death experience had its start in the 1960s. The New York Times calls him the father of the near-death experience. They don't say it that way, but I did. He got his M.D. from the Medical College of Georgia. 1976, he got his Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Virginia. 1969, an M.A. in philosophy from the University of Virginia. 1967, B.A. with honors in philosophy from the University of Virginia. He's a University of Virginia man. But he's more than that. Dr. Jack Turner is a noted neurosurgeon with a degree in engineering physics from Ohio University. He is also the author of the bestseller Medicine, Miracles, and Manifestation, a culmination of 20 years of research into the field of neurosurgery via integral medicine, examining metaphysical events such as remote viewing, telepathy, consciousness, and life after death as verifiable manifestations of the way in which the human brain interfaces with universal consciousness. Dr. Turner has provided invaluable wisdom, research, and advice for ongoing development of the film, which we're going to touch on a little later on. He is also one of the leaders for the online forum for the film entitled BARD, Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. It's Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, you two guys.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for having me. It's great to hear from you.
Oh, Brother Ray, I haven't heard from you since 2002.
That's right. I've got 2 little ones now, 2 adopted ones, and they keep us pretty busy, 12 and 9. But I always think of you, Bob.
I know you do.
And it's just so delightful to hear your voice again.
Ditto. Jack, you there?
I'm here. Maybe we're all brothers today. This will be a good conversation then. Thank you for having me back, and thank you, Dr. Moody, for allowing me to join you again.
Okay. Well, are you going to say something, Dr. Moody? I'm sorry.
No, just that this is a true delight to me because I think that we're in a very crucial period of world history right now, and I think all 3 of us are aware of that, and that I think the kind of work that we've all been interested in for a long time is very important in the world developments that are going on right now.
Well, that's true, especially in the work we're going to talk about tonight. This is the most important book I have read in a long time. It really opens up the field, a field of knowledge that I think is going to be so important to most human beings because we all have this involvement with death sooner or later in our life. Now, Dr. Moody, what is new in the field of near-death studies?
Well, Bob, what I am confident in saying now is that this experience that is known all over the world now and has been studied by physicians all over the world, which we've come to call the near-death experiences, which happen to people who are on the verge of death, that every element of that experience also occurs often among the bystanders to the death of the dying loved one. That is, that I can confidently say to you that very often when someone is there in the final hours or minutes of a loved one's life, that as the person in the bed passes away, the bystanders themselves often have all of these phenomena that we have come to call the near-death experience. For example, the bystander may say that as the person in the bed dies, the bystander sees what seems to be a transparent replica of the person sort of rise up from the body. This is often described as globular in form or golden in form, or other times sort of conforming to the shape of the living body, but a transparent replica. Often also we hear that the bystanders themselves, as a person in the bed passes away, that the bystanders themselves may feel that they leave their physical bodies and view the scene from above. Also, we hear of bystanders hearing beautiful music, the same kind of music that we hear reported by people with near-death experiences. We often hear the bystanders tell us that as the person in the bed dies, the room fills with this intense light that gives great comfort and peace, and is often sort of pervaded almost with this compassionate love. We hear bystanders tell us that as the person that they're with dies, that they see what we would call apparitions or spirits of the dying person seem to appear at the bedside to escort the dying person away. And most remarkably of all, Bob, I have numerous cases in which someone at the bedside empathically co-lives the panoramic life review of the person who is dying. And what this seems to signify to me is that this essentially does away with the neurophysiological explanation that is often advanced to explain away these near-death experiences. That is, that when someone almost dies and comes back with one of these reports, then at least in our society, a superficially a plausible explanation of the near-death experience is that as the person dies, the oxygen flow to their brain is diminished, and hence this hallucinatory phenomenon is thrown up, which is called a near-death experience. But the trouble with that explanation is that identically this same phenomenon is described quite often by the bystanders at the bedside of the dying. And so in those cases, there is no illness. The bystanders are not ill or injured. There's nothing going awry with their brains. So I think, Bob, that this takes us into an entirely different level of debate about this phenomenon. I think that we've now got to own up to the fact that something is going on here which is just very, very difficult, I think, to account for the terms of explanation that are most widely accepted in this society. I think that another way of saying this is that, in effect, I think that we can almost do away with the category of near-death experiences and talk about this phenomenon that occurs at the bedside of the dying, both to dying people, but also to the people standing around. And that is something that is just very, very difficult to put together, I think, in the normal scientific world in which we live. And I know that, Bob, you have been a student of Wittgenstein, and I know in the past, and Hume, and will understand what I mean by scientific.
Yes.
That unfortunately, in the modern world, the society has induced us to assume that the only rational way of establishing the truth is through the scientific method, and that's just not correct. Matter of fact, it's an incoherent point of view, and that I think to really begin to comprehend these empathic or shared death experiences, we're going to have to come up with entirely new methods of explanation and exploration. So I think that we are just on the cusp here of, I am confidently saying, rather astonishing new developments in the rational investigation of what I regard anyway, and I know you do too, the greatest mystery of humankind, which is the mystery of life after death.
Well, it certainly is that, and as a matter of fact, you had a personal death, a shared death experience, which we're going to talk about later on, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
But I want to get to Dr. Jack Turner here. Jack, what led you to work with Dr. Moody?
Well, I would say, Bob, that I'm rather working for Dr. Moody because we're involved in a couple of projects, and of course I followed his work from the beginning with Life After Life and learned all about what he's learned with Dr. Ritchie and how it all began. And then through my career, I've had cases of patients who will tell me about these experiences, but of course I had been studying them, and it's interesting, I didn't seek out the patients. They kind of volunteered this information, but somewhat reluctantly, but cautiously. It's not something that they like to talk about because someone has always shot them down when they brought up what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So at any rate, we're involved in several projects that we're going to talk about today, and the first is Dr. Moody's lecture series, which will begin in 2011. We're not sure of the exact date yet, but it's called the Luminary Lecture Series, and he'll be the first of the great people who have done magnificent work to begin his talks, and also a very interesting workshop in which Dr. Moody can speak of his logic and what he's discovered and what he calls the wisdom of nonsense, and I'll probably leave that to him to discuss. But we're involved in a couple of film projects and TV projects, and these are all exciting. So Bob, I'm really working for Dr. Moody because I think this book, His Glimpses of Eternity, is certainly a really groundbreaking book because he's collected many cases. I think the first book ever that's been able to review a lot of this. It's been known, in the past that these things have happened. But yet, Dr. Moody has put it together in a way that actually and literally makes light come from those pages of the book. So I'm quite honored to be working for Dr. Moody.
Well, that's pretty understandable. I'm honored to have both of you on this show, especially on this particular work, because I think it's going to give people a great deal more hope to get on with their lives rather than to feel that they have lost something that they'll never experience again, which is certainly going to be the big surprise as we pass on to the other side and welcomed by many of our loved ones that have already passed on before us. We're going to need to take a break here, and when we come back, I'm going to ask Dr. Moody if he will explain or tell us about his shared near-death experience within his family. This is 21st Century Radio. I'm what's left of Dr. Bob Hieronimus and his incarnation friends, and our guests are Dr. Raymond Moody and Dr. John Turner. Tours of the Afterlife and Moody's new book, Glimpses of Eternity, sharing a loved one's passage from this life to the next, published by Guideposts. And that's linked on the front page at 21stcenturyradio.com.
Hello, this is Stanley Krippner. I'm professor of psychology at Saybrook Graduate School in San Francisco on behalf of 21st Century Radio, run by Dr. Bob Hieronimus. And I would certainly encourage listeners to stay tuned because you will hear things on 21st Century Radio that you'll hear nowhere else on the airways.
Well, thank you, Dr. Krippner. He was my mentor. I worked under him for 5.5 years to finish my Ph.D., and he was tough. Well, he should be, of course. You don't go to get your Ph.D. just to have a good time. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Our guests are Doctors Raymond Moody and John Turner, tours of the afterlife and Moody's new book, Glimpses of Eternity, sharing a loved one's passage from this life into the next, published by Guideposts on the web at toursoftheafterlife.com, linked on the front page at 21stcenturyradio.com. Now, Raymond, you had a personal experience that occurred, let's see, I guess it was May of 1994.
I did, Bob, and in terms of the background of this, as you know, I had first heard a living person report a near-death experience in 1965. That was Dr. George Ritchie, a person you know very well as well. And so when I got my Ph.D. in philosophy, I started teaching philosophy at East Carolina University. But in 1972, I entered medical school after having been a philosophy professor for 3 years. So when I entered medical school in 72, I already had quite a number of these near-death experiences that I had collected from students and business people there in the town where I lived in North Carolina. But anyway, around the end of my first quarter in medical school, I was in the bookstore one night, and a very nice lady came in and introduced herself as Dr. So-and-so. I won't use her name, but I immediately recognized that as a very well-respected professor of medicine there at the medical college. And the way she had recognized me was that the faculty had a book of photographs of all of the incoming students, and she knew that I was doing this work on near-death experiences. So she said that she had a story to tell me about. So she led me across the campus that night to her office, and she told me that some little while before, she had been there when her own mother had died. But as her mother had a cardiac arrest, this physician very vigorously tried to resuscitate her mother, but she said at the moment that she saw that her mother passed away, she herself, this physician, felt that she left her body and rose up and looked down. She saw her mother's now deceased body on the bed, and she saw her own body beside the bed trying to resuscitate her mother. And to use her exact words, because I wrote them down that night, she said, "I was trying to get my bearings." And as she was in the state of, what's going on, that sort of attitude, she became aware of her mother, again to use her exact words, now in spirit form there beside her. And she said that she said her goodbyes to her mother, and she saw her mother recede into this intense light that seemed to be beaming out of a tube, as she described it. And in that light, she saw emerging from that light the spirits of relatives and friends of her mother's who had already died, who seemed to be coming to greet her mother. And then she saw her mother kind of merge with these people, and they were all pulled back into this light. And she saw she said that as this tube closed off, it did so in a spiral, like a camera lens closes. And then this physician found herself back in her own body, up beside the now deceased body of her mother. Now, that was the first case I had heard, Bob, of what I've come to call a shared death experience, or an empathic death experience, in which the bystander has the sense that they are empathically co-living the dying experience of someone there with them. When I wrote Life After Life in 1974, that was the only case of a shared death experience I had, and I didn't want to include it for that reason, but also in case, it would have been difficult to tell that story without letting, in effect, sort of giving clues to people around that might be able to identify that woman. So I didn't talk anything about that in my first book mainly because I only had the one case. But in the intervening years, I began to hear a lot of stories like that from physicians and nurses who said, for example, that as a patient died, they saw what seemed to be the spirit leave the body of the patient, or saw the light in the room change, or sometimes sensed apparitions. So I continued to investigate this, and in 1994, I had reached a point where I had enough cases to realize that this was something really important. What began to happen, Bob, in the early 80s was that whereas up to that time I had heard these mostly from physicians, in the early, then mid, and then late 80s and early 90s, I began to hear more of these from the bystanders at the bedside of a dying loved one, like the relatives and friends who were gathered there at the bedside. And what I could tell was happening was that, believe it or not, for anybody who can think back this far, in 1972, when I started medical school, the standard procedure was that when the patient was dying, the doctors and nurses would come and they would escort the family away on the theory that we had then that this would be too overwhelming for the family members and so on. But gradually since that time, the hospital rules and procedures have changed so that now in 2010, it's more the standard procedure that when the patient is dying, the doctors and nurses encourage the family to be there. And unless the medical personnel has some particular special relationship with that patient, the medical personnel are generally absent and make this a family matter. Now, corresponding to that, since in the early 70s I was hearing these mostly from medical doctors and nurses, but now I'm hearing just a tidal wave of these things from other relatives who are there at the bedside of the dying. Well, anyway, in 94, I had reached the point where I wanted to do a systematic study of this. So I went with some friends, other psychologists and psychiatrists, out to a state in the West where we did a gathering to figure out how to study this. And that was in May of 1994. Well, it happened to be Mother's Day on the day that we finished our meeting. So I went to the local shopping mall and I used the payphone, which is, to think about it, now an antique, but at the time was it was literally a little payphone. And so I went there and to call my mom and to wish her a happy Mother's Day. When she picked up the phone, I of course asked her, well, how are you doing? And so she, I remember her voice was just very, very chipper and happy. And she said, "Oh, I'm doing great," was her words. And then she mentioned that the day before that she had developed a rash. That was on a Saturday. So my brothers and sisters had taken her to the doctor just to get it checked out, but the doctor examined her and said, in effect, that he didn't think this was anything serious. He said it was just some sort of idiosyncratic reaction, but as a precaution, he gave her an appointment with another doctor on that following Monday, which was the day after Mother's Day. So on Sunday, when I had my conversation with my mom, everything was apparently fine. Well, the next day, when my mom went to the doctor said, "You have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and you have 2 days to 2 weeks to live." Well, my wife and I went to the hospital, and we were there with my mom the entire 2 weeks until she did pass away, 2 weeks after the diagnosis. And as she was dying, Bob, I had this experience myself, and so did my wife and my sister who was there in the room and my brother-in-law. Basically, as people will often tell you in these things, I don't really have the vocabulary to explain it except to say that, for want of a better term, the geometry of the room changed. And, you know, a hospital room is like a cubicle, right? But in an indescribable fashion, it was as though this room had the conformation of an hourglass almost. In other words, it was constricted at the middle, sort of as though it was something like a funnel, for the best term I can use. And the room filled with this just almost palpable light. I mean, I learned from that experience that what these people call light and the near-death experience, they struggle with the words. You could call it light, or you could call it love, or you could call it consciousness, but whatever you want to call it, there it was. And in the midst of this, I heard my mother say, as she was passing away, "I love you." But in saying heard, I don't mean exactly an auditory quality. This was like coming, like you would think, mind to mind or heart to heart. My wife there in the room, who is a very, very grounded and realistic person, she was president of the National Broadcast Association Community Affairs Division. She had her own television news magazine program in St. Petersburg for 10 years. Just a very, very grounded person, had the same experience that I did. My sister felt the spirit of my father there, who had died 18 months before. And so I'm sure you can understand, being a person like me who's driven mostly by curiosity, what that did, Bob, was that since I was pursuing this investigation primarily out of curiosity, having the experience directly myself sort of diffused my curiosity, and it took me a long time to sort of integrate this. I mean, it was a very, very powerful experience. But anyway, since that time, I continued gathering cases, and finally, a couple of years ago, a good friend of mine, Paul Perry, said, "Well, why don't we write these up and put them together?" And so I did, and so that's how the new book, Glimpses of Eternity, came along.
Well, we are about ready to take our final break of this hour. When we return, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Turner about what he feels is the best evidence for the survival of consciousness. We'll be back with Doctors Raymond Moody and John Turner.
This is Dr. Sally Ryan Feather, the daughter of Dr. J.B. and Louisa Ryan that started the ESP research at Duke University. And I have just appeared on the Bob Hieronimus show. I think this kind of radio does so much for the public. It brings them information where they can get no other way.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sally Ryan Feather. Boy, we had a good time with Sally. What is that song? Hot Rod Sally? No. Mustang Sally. It was Mustang Sally. That's what it was. This is 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus. Doctors Raymond Moody and Jack Turner. Tours of the Afterlife, and Moody's new book, Glimpses of Eternity, sharing a loved one's passage from this life to the next. It's published by Guidepost. This is one of the most important books you could ever possibly read. Now, Jack, what do you feel is the best evidence for survival of consciousness?
Well, I'd like to answer that in a backwards fashion. I'd like to mention some types of evidence that people feel is the proof, the real proof of the afterlife or survival of consciousness. For example, Dr. Gary Schwartz feels that his work with mediums and the information that a mental medium can obtain is absolute proof that there is this, what we call an afterlife, or the other side of the veil. Then there are others, such as Dr. Craig Hogan and Alan Bakken, who feel that eye movement, desensitization, and reprogramming can lead to what they call induced after-death experiences. And they can take someone out of the audience at a meeting and put them through this type of eye movement desensitization and actually induce a meeting with someone who has passed on. They feel that this is absolutely the best proof. There are others, and actually the reason I'm on this show now and before and with Dr. Moody is that when my friend and webmaster Martin Simmons made his passing, he had agreed to work with me on researching the afterlife through an electronic means, which is called EVP, electronic voice phenomena. And that led to experiments with that and my involvement, and I've met people like my friend David Roundtree, master's in electrical engineering and soon a PhD in physics, who scientifically applies his knowledge to the electronic voice phenomena and instrumental transcommunication to show that there is a way to communicate with those who have passed on electronically. David is open-minded. He's not biased one way or the other. He just wants to show what is going on. So these are some of the various ways that people say are proof. Others have investigated things like, well, could this certainly be a manifestation of something within the brain? And we've talked before about drugs such as LSD and ketamine, and also the centrifuge research projects of Dr. Winnery and things like this, where some of the aspects of the near-death experience can be generated, such as light phenomena, sometimes detachment from the body. But never have there been the key things that developed with that type of experimentation, which come after the near-death experiences, and those are a change in outlook on life and behavior, and understanding more about the meaning of love. These other things don't generate that panoramic life review and so forth. So my answer to your question, I feel the best evidence is the shared or empathic near-death experiences, and that's why I'm anxious to help promote Dr. Moody's great work, because I agree with you, Bob, this is one of the greatest books, and we're on the cusp of something very important. So with that, I'd like to turn it over back to Dr. Moody with this question. Empathic. I was watching something on the 9/11 TV yesterday, and it was a lady talking about her husband who had predicted 9/11 and then died in the disaster. And as she talked, of course, it brought tears to my eyes, and that's what I think is the empathy. So my question for Dr. Moody is, to share this experience, this empathic experience, does someone really have to have a connection with the dying person, or just being there when this happens will allow anyone to participate when this does happen?
Well, actually, I don't think so, because now the first case I ever heard was by this medical doctor I mentioned, and in that case she had both a personal relationship with the person who was her mother, and also a relationship with as a physician. But initially, as I said, back in the 70s and 80s, I heard these mostly from physicians or nurses who were there when somebody died. And in many cases, these were doctors, for example, who just happened to be on call in the emergency room, and a patient came in, and they were the person there who happened to resuscitate that patient, but they had no personal connection previously with the patient, and yet nonetheless had these very dramatic empathic experiences. So I don't think there is necessarily a requirement for a close personal relationship with the individual. Now, that said, I think these days we're hearing them mostly, as I mentioned, because of the change in hospital practice from relatives and loved ones at the bedside. But I don't think it's a necessary condition, because I have had plenty of cases of doctors who just happened to be there at the time when a patient they had never known came in, and that they were the person to resuscitate them. But I think that the one thing that I've never seen thus far is a case in which the bystander who was there had one of these panoramic life reviews. In other words, that they co-lived the life review of the dying person. And all of the cases I've had of that, the individual who experienced the co-experienced the panoramic life review was a person who was connected very closely with the dying individual. But all of these other elements, I've heard from physicians, for example, who were just happened to be there when a patient had a cardiac arrest and so on. So it was a very, very interesting thing here. And just to tell you the truth, this is really baffling. Personally, as Bob knows, and I think you're aware too, John, I was not raised a religious person, and had my first telescope, or built my first telescope when I was 8 years old, and was a devotee of astronomy from the age of 7, as I still am. And being not religious and having that astronomical interest, I had concluded pretty early in my life that when you die, your body dissolves and your consciousness goes to zero. And I think that the opinions you form or the ideas that you have as a...
Did we lose him? Oh, gosh, Rudy. Jack, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Well, I'm sure he'll return. My producer will check that out.
Okay, well, let me expound upon what he's saying. That makes it really proof, because when people who are not connected with the patient can experience these things, then it kind of goes out of the realm of imagination or fantasy or prior knowledge. And so that's why I think that this work is actually the proof.
Well, Ray has just joined us again. I wanted to ask something before we run out of time this hour. You mentioned Dr. Botkin induced near-death experiences. He joined us a little while back. He works with those who have had great stress, who were in wars, by and large, and through other people who were non-living that they had some relationship with, either killed in the war or something along those lines. They have been able to work out and resolve some of their very severe problems in post-traumatic stress syndrome, et cetera, et cetera. You're aware of that then, huh?
Oh, yes. I had been very interested in how that eye movement desensitization works, and then how he discovered, quite accidentally, that it can induce these after-death experiences and can heal grief and, in a quick manner, as opposed to regular type of therapy and counseling. So I think there's a lot to be said in how the brain mechanism and consciousness is all tied in. And I think what we're finding out, and Dr. Ray Moody will agree, that all learning is a matter of remembering. I think that was one of Plato's sayings, and I think we're starting now, as we learn, we're really starting to remember. And I think these are things we've always known, and we just have to realize that. And I think this is something big is about ready to happen, just as Raymond said.
I think so. It's almost as if the veil has been thinning for a period of time, and the dimension, which is right next to ours, is becoming more attainable. I think that that's going to be a very important factor in the decade to come, especially with people in their spiritual experiences, because there isn't a part of us that is immortal. Ray, you were saying something?
Yes, that's exactly what I was getting at, that despite this fact that, this was a very hard thing for me to come to terms with, since it wasn't something I was exposed to as a child. But I feel personally I've been kind of boxed into a corner here, and that's that anything I could say under these circumstances other than that there does seem to be a state of existence after death now strikes me as though I'm trying to run away from something or escape from something, rather than just to face the most plausible thing to say, which is that there does seem to be life after death. And nobody could be more surprised by that than me, really, because of the particular background and childhood I had. But, it's kind of like I give up.
I share that with you.
If the people at the bedside are saying the same thing, then that certainly knocks the foundation out from under the neurophysiological explanation.
It sure does. Now, there are so many wonderful stories. They're more than stories. They're factual events. I'd say that there are at least a score or so of these. And so if you think that this is a highly technical book from that standpoint, you can easily understand this process, especially by listening to the stories themselves, reading them, that is. And then we need to get into the 7 elements of the shared death experience and how you can prime yourself, because this book actually discusses the possibility of a method by which you might be able to have a near-death shared experience with others. Isn't that correct, sir?
Well, I think absolutely, Bob. Just the mere fact of knowing about this, I think, gives people, in effect, permission to be ready for it when they're there at the bedside of someone who's passing away, which, with all the baby boomers now going through that phase of life in which they're losing their parents, as we all know, this is a very, very common thing that's happening now. And yes. I think that because of this, we really are in the midst of a tidal wave of these shared death experiences.
Well, we need to take a break here at the top of the hour with our guests, Doctors Raymond Moody and John Turner, Tours of the Afterlife, which was mentioned a little bit earlier, and Moody's new book, Glimpses of Eternity, Sharing a Loved One's Passage from This Life to the Next, published by Guidepost, linked on the front page of 21stCenturyRadio.com. Now, listen to my favorite song in the whole world. Friends, I'm going to quote somebody I have high regard for, okay? Because you ever thought about cultural lag or science lag or knowledge lag? Well, Goethe looked into this. This is what he said. He said, in the sciences, if anyone advances anything new, people resist with all their might. They speak of the new view with contempt, as if it were not worth the trouble of even so much as an investigation or regard. And thus, a new truth may wait a long time before it can win its way. There's a lot of that happening in all areas of knowledge. When we talk about UFOs, you're going to be so surprised to see or hear from so many generals, colonels, and other guys within the military talk about their UFO experiences. It's coming out. It's coming out of the woodwork. So we better paint it over or something. Now, our guests, of course, are Doctors Raymond Moody and Dr. John Turner, Tours of the Afterlife, and Moody's new book, Glimpses of Eternity, Sharing a Loved One's Passage from This Life to the Next, published by Guidepost. And Dr. Moody, We're calling our class together now, friends. Everyone get ready to take some notes. This is important. If you want to know the 7 elements of the shared death experience is, number 1, change of geometry. Number 2, I'll mention it, and then you can just tell us what they are. Change of geometry. Does this mean you got to go to Algebra 604 or something?
Well, apparently so. That if basically people tell us that when they enter into this state of consciousness, Bob, space, as you and I have experienced it in this world, is no longer applicable. People say rather than going from a 3-dimensional geometry, they enter into a state of consciousness at the bedside of the dying where I've had people tell me such things as that they can, the walls become permeable. The wall is no longer a barrier to seeing the outside. Or as in my case, which I've also heard from other people, that the room itself begins to sort of constrict in the middle, and you feel like you're in a sort of funnel. So as you enter into this altered state of existence or other state of existence, the 3-dimensional rules of geometry that we have that work in everyday life don't really work anymore to describe the experience you're going through.
So that's change of geometry, friends. The second one, and a lot of people have heard of this, is mystical light.
Yes, people say that the room just fills with light. And a very common thing that people say in this is that at first they think it's something beaming into the room through the window or something, but like some reflection from outside. But very quickly they realize that this is not light as we appreciate it here in this frame of existence, but something else, which they may equate with love or intense consciousness. The best words that some can put on it is a conscious light, or a light of complete love and compassion seems to be present in the room as someone dies.
Mm-hmm. So far we got change of geometry, mystical light, and then there is music and music sounds. Yes,
I hear this all the time. People hear, as their loved ones are dying, they hear beautiful music that's certainly not coming over the intercom of the hospital in any way. And this corresponds very nicely to what we hear from people who have near-death experiences. The same thing. They say that in their near-death experience, they hear beautiful music.
And I think also the out-of-body experience is linked to that.
Yes. I've had quite a number of people who, at the bedside of dying loved ones, tell us that they themselves leave their body and that they go part way toward this light with their dying loved one.
Mm-hmm. So far we got change of geometry, mystical light, music and musical sounds, and out-of-body experience. Number 4 is a co-living life review.
Yes, and Bob, of all of these, this to me is just the most amazing thing. I've heard this from numerous people now, and so much so that I'm confident that any sincere investigator who really looks into this is going to find cases of this. And the most remarkable one was a woman I knew about 20-plus years ago in Carrollton, Georgia, an elderly woman who had one of these marriages in which literally she married her childhood friend. They grew up together in this small town, and then in high school married, and or after they graduated from high school, and so they were married for several decades. But as her husband was dying, she was there with him in the hospital, And she said suddenly everything that he had ever done sprang up around them in this three-dimensional, fully colored, holographic panorama. And in connection with this being of complete compassion who was there with them, helping to review this. And she said as these scenes unfolded, she actually could converse with her husband about him, who was plainly seeing this too. So incredible as it may seem, there are abundant, I'm sure, cases of people who say that as their loved one died, they empathically co-lived the life review of the dying person.
Okay, so we got 4 so far. Change of geometry, mystical light, music and musical sounds, out-of-body experience, and co-living, a life review lesson. 5 is encountering unworldly or heavenly realms. Oh, this is just so thrilling, this part.
Yes. One particular case is of a man who was a hospice counselor who told me that on a couple of occasions as patients were dying, he became aware of what he tried to put into words as like structures or cities of sheer light. And as you know, Bob, this is what we hear also quite often from people with very profound near-death experiences. Dr. George Ritchie described this, for example, seeing cities of sheer light that seem to be filled with these beings of complete love and compassion. So we can now say that this is sometimes glimpsed also by the bystanders who say that it's as though this dimension kind of, or a veil kind of parts, and they can see into a heavenly realm right there at the bedside of the dying.
Number 6 is mist at death. This is really exciting because I've heard that there, and from other sources, that it is even possible to weigh that mist.
Well, yeah, this is something I hear just all the time. I began to hear this from doctors back in the late 70s and through the 80s. Now I hear it very often from loved ones who are present at the bedside, and that is that as the person in the bed dies, the bystanders may see what seems to be like a transparent replica of the person sort of just stand up and move away from the body, or sometimes this is described as a more globular form, like roundish or golden gray colored light, which seems to exit the body from around the area of the head or chest, and very often it seems to rise up into, as far as the bystanders can tell, just a sort of exit through the ceiling.
Mm-hmm. And a different world is number 7.
A different world in the sense that when people come back from this, they tell us that the world is no longer the same. I hear this from people all the time. And as you can well imagine, as on the interviews I've had, I've been giving on this project in the last few weeks. It's interesting how many people who call me to find out about it have had this experience themselves. Just the other day, for example, a wonderful young journalist called me and was asking some very penetrating questions about my new book, and she then at the end she said, "Well, I found this book very interesting," and then she went on to say because she had this happen to her when her own mother died, and that she had been sort of keeping it to herself because she didn't know what word to put on it. And I'm sure, Bob, that many, many people are going to be having that same reaction because I can pretty much guarantee you, I haven't done a systematic study on this, but from watching now over couple of decades, many audiences, I can pretty much assure you that these empathic death experiences are as common or maybe even more common than as the near-death experiences that we already know about. And in a way, that would stand to reason if you think about it, because most people who have a cardiac arrest sadly do go ahead and die. But there are a lot more bystanders around who go on living after the death of a loved one and are able to tell these things to us. So I think that we're on to something here that is going to put an entirely new light on the old forms of debate. I mean, it's not going to work anymore to say, oh, these experiences are the oxygen deprivation to the brain, because the bystanders are not ill or injured, and yet they have this same experience. And at the same time, some of the scoffers may choose at this point to say, well, in the case of the person with a near-death experience, it's the cutoff of the oxygen flow to the brain. But as for the bystanders, it's just that they're so emotional or hysterical or guilty of wishful thinking or whatever. And that's just not a rational move. I mean, you know yourself from your interviews, and any journalist, for example, would, that, or any attorney, that if you're presenting a case to somebody and they offer you one objection, and then you refute that objection, and then they just move to some other kind of objection, then that's a sign that they have a weak case. I think that the intellectually honest thing to do here is just to say, oh my goodness, I mean, this is something really, really difficult, I think, to put together in the normal physicalistic view of the world.
Well, one of the reasons I've always admired the sciences is because of the willing suspension of judgment over a period of time, so you can work these problems out.
Yes.
But unfortunately, that's not been happening with all the people competing to be right when they haven't even studied the material. I see this in just about everything. Let me go over these 7 elements once more. Change of geometry, mystical light, music and musical sounds, out-of-body experience, co-living, a life review, encountering unworldly or heavenly realms, missed at death, a different world. Now, all of these elements are carefully analyzed and discussed within the book, but we just whipped right on through that. I want to get back to Jack, but I want to end up with you with the question, Dr. Moody, on priming yourself. How can you prime yourself with a shared death experience? But first, Jack, what is the science behind this? Not just the shared death experience, but the near-death experience, the OBE, because you paid a lot of attention to this.
Well, that has a lot to do with how we define consciousness, and that's not an easy thing at all. There are many scientific studies that have been done to try to understand this, and the best way I can answer that in this limited time is to direct your listeners to 2 great authors who have written about the science. And one is the noted Dr. Pim van Lommel, the cardiologist in the Netherlands, who wrote Consciousness Beyond Life, and it's subtitled The Science of the Near-Death Experience. And I'll tell you, I think with that book, hand in hand, goes another great book by Chris Carter called Science and the Near-Death Experience, How Consciousness Survives Death. Now, I think your readers will find in these 2 books, among many others, but these 2 will guide one to where you need to look if you have any questions or if you're a little bit skeptical, and let's say about the oxygen, the hypercarbia, which is building up of CO2, these other things that are tried to use to explain away this as being a manifestation of the brain. I think these 2 books will really wake someone up, and then if they top this off with Dr. Moody's great book, Glimpses of Eternity, well, they'll have the whole package.
Well, what was the name of the first book?
Dr. Pim Van Lommel, a cardiologist who wrote in 2001, published the great work in Lancet that's raised a lot of eyebrows.
Could you spell his last name?
Yes, Pim is his first name, P-I-M, then Van, V-A-N, then L-O-M-M-E-L. And the paper, which you can find on the Internet, is called Near-Death Experience in Survivors of Cardiac Arrest, a prospective study in the Netherlands. And this was published in 2001, and it had a lot of pro and con, comments made about it, but it began to take interest. And like Dr. Moody, he first heard about this with, George C. Ritchie's experience. So things are very parallel, but these things will give your listeners an idea of where to find the science. So Pim Van Lommel and then Chris Carter.
Thank you very much. Now, Raymond, tell us about how it might be possible, because you're not saying that this is exactly what it might be, but you're saying that there's a good chance of it, I believe, that you can prime yourself for a shared death experience.
Well, I think the main thing, Bob, is to go back to a hero of yours and mine, and that is Plato. And I don't mean to go literally and read his works, but nonetheless to take on that attitude, which is that we owe it almost to ourselves as human beings to look courageously into this question of life after death, because it's the most important question of human existence, and it's the question upon which all the other questions turn. Now, in that sense, I think that even knowing about these experiences primes people in the sense that not that it causes the experience, but that people who are aware of this are, I think, more at peace as they go into the situation of the death of a loved one, to prepare oneself with the knowledge that we've already have about near-death experiences and shared death experiences, I think creates the context in which people are more likely to have such experiences, or at least, if they do have them, to be able to talk about them more openly. Mm-hmm. This, even though I had studied this many years, Bob, when it happened to me in 1994, it really took me by surprise. It really did. And in retrospect, I realized that if instead of looking directly at my mother as I did, I was focused directly on her, I realized subsequently if I had sort of let myself go and sort of looked upward more in a stance of relaxation, I do appreciate in retrospect that at that point I would have been out of my body. Mm-hmm. So I think the primary thing is education, in the sense that to normalize these things, that this is not anything particularly extraordinary, rather that this is part of the process of living, and the process of living, of course, also includes the process of dying. So I think more than anything else, it becomes what's needed is becoming comfortable with this idea of death, and to talk about it, to talk openly with when you have a terminal, a loved one with a terminal condition, to talk openly with them about their death, and certainly, by all means, to be with them throughout the process, and not to be afraid to be there with dying loved ones. I've had many cases in my clinical practice where patient's family, somebody in the family, was reluctant to go into the actual death, and I would sort of gently lead them in, and they invariably tell me in retrospect that they were grateful for that. So I think courage is what's needed here, courage to inquire into this and to realize that, as was it James Jeans who said that the world is not merely more, it's not merely stranger than we imagine.
Oh,
it's
yes.
stranger than we can imagine.
Yes, that's it. So, as you note in your book, develop a well-developed sense of empathy is one element, and a sense also of acceptance or surrender that the loved one is going to die, and that acceptance might well be one of the doors to having such an experience. Wow.
That's exactly right.
Now, this is just wonderful to know and to be able to pass on to tens of millions on this planet. Because you've only sold 13 million copies of the other book. We got to get it's probably going to triple that.
I think that this is very, very important information. I do. I think that this puts an entirely different light on the study of near-death experiences in connection with the biggest question of all.
Well, friends, there's a lot of things we didn't get a chance to touch on, such as people being transformed by these experiences. We didn't talk about the mirror neurons and are they the key to undiscovered other senses. We didn't talk about the Dr. Jonas Salk and the translate states that he went through while creating 3 books with tens of thousands of pages. Just amazing stuff in here. And I think most of all you need to do is get a copy of this book, read it with an open mind, and I believe you're going to live a different life, begin living a different life, because I know many of you are struggling with these things right now. And as a matter of fact, on page 180, Dr. Moody said, shared death experiences carry with them redemption, hope, grace, and transformation. Wow. Big stuff, you guys. You guys still there? Or
Yep.
Did I talk you to death?
I'm mesmerized by hearing Dr. Moody talk. It's always wonderful.
And
Certainly.
likewise, Jack. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both for joining us, Dr. Raymond Moody and Jack Turner, Dr. Jack Turner that is, and please go on the web to 21stcenturyradio.com, and when we return, we got some important topics to discuss. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington, and I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus.